Hello and welcome to the first of my Python Intermediate series. We're going to begin looking at subroutines, but before I do that, if you are not familiar with your IDE or you are not familiar with any of the highlighted statements here, print, input, handling variables, basic data types, lists, loops and Boolean logic, please go back and see a previous video in my Python for Beginners series to cover that, or parts of this series will not make sense to you. Okay, so let's start by looking at what a subroutine is at a graphical level. And it is just a set of instructions that are contained within a single instruction that a programmer can make. So in this case we have a subroutine called DoSomething, and inside that subroutine it executes an input and an output. That should of course be a lowercase. Unfortunately, I guess the software automatically added a capital for me and I didn't notice when I created the diagram. So how does that look in code? Well, that's right here. And if we bring that across to our IDE, this is PyCharm. The same should work in more or less any IDE that supports Python debugging. Right, okay, so this is just telling me that the DoSomething should ideally be named slightly differently. This does sometimes catch me out when I am moving between different development languages. However, it is almost identical. There we go. So we have a define and then a function name. We're going to look at what happens potentially in those brackets shortly. Same with everything else that has indented code. We have a colon followed by lines and indent. Everything in here is part of the subroutine DoSomething. So this input and this print statement. And I'm going to put a breakpoint on this and I'm going to step through this one level at a time. So the code starts running here. It's defined here and it must be defined above where it's called. It's called here. So I step in. Name equals input. We step in again. We can ignore this. This is just so you can see actually input in itself internally is actually a subroutine in Python. But I'm going to stop that and run it again without stepping into it. I just wanted you to see actually what goes on in the background. This input is just a subroutine. Okay, so let's run that again, and this time we're going to step over like we do normally. So if I step over the whole thing, it skips all of that. It then comes here because it was just skipped everything, checks name, and then it outputs hi, welcome. That's pain. Okay, so one more time. Sam, I'm going to step into the first time, so we come in here. Make sure we can see the console. We step over this one. It asks us for our name. Then it stops and it waits. I step over again and we get the output. Okay, so we need to have a little look at scope and code blocks. Now I'm going to bring this code into the IDE. And then we'll talk through this. So what we've got here, we have a variable has been declared, and it is an empty list. It's been declared as an empty list. We can tell that because it's by the square brackets with nothing in between. We have a function that is define user input. Now, this is the interesting part, because we can read this list here inside a function or a subroutine, whichever you want to call it, but we can not write to it unless we have this global statement there. So to write into this here, we have to add this global here. Now, what is global? Global scope is everything outside of a function, outside of a loop, outside of an if-else, etc. Everything inside here, everything that's indented, is considered to be local scope to the function. And that's key. Because if we look at this here, we've got a variable that's been declared here, and it's input, hi, what is your name? That's fairly obvious to understand. We're doing a list data.append name. So after we've taken the user input, we're going to store whatever they give us into this list. We can do that because we've declared it as global scope. However, down here, outside the function, we have a print statement. Now, you can see the name has been declared, but it's underlined in red. Because it's been declared inside this subroutine, it is only available to the subroutine. So it's available where all this code is indented. If I had something like that. Oops, sorry. It's still accessible because this is still inside this function or this subroutine. So we have global scope and local scope, and each different function you create has its own local scope. So let's have another quick look at what I said before about being able to pass items in. Okay, so once again, I have got a defined function called greeting. We're going to pass in a value. Now this is just a variable. I've called it username. Once we've inside the function, we're going to use this variable username to create a print statement. So this time when we run the code, the first thing it's going to do is this line here. Show the console. Okay, so the next one that we do, then we step into this one. The next stage is that we pass this variable that we've just created and stored an input from into our function greeting. I'm going to step into it, and you can see here that the value is assigned to this variable here. Notice how I've used different variable names here and here. That is done to avoid confusion. It makes it very clear which one of these is in which scope area. Then finally we step over and finish. Now, once again, we're going to sort of take this one step further. As well as passing in single parameters, we can pass in multiple parameters. So maybe I should zoom this in just a bit more, make it easier to read. Now you'll notice that I'm spreading stuff out a bit. This is just readability. On the web page it makes sense to condense it to stop the page sprawling, but in the IDE I would always spread stuff out a little bit. So we've got a few differences to look at here. And I'm just going to put them side by side for a moment actually. Because I think it's important to look at this bit. We've actually got Python code here that is running above this bit here. It doesn't matter. You can have code above and below. However, it is important to realize that anything that is used by this function must be defined before the function is called. It is called here. Therefore, any variables that are passed in here must be defined before this runs. In other words, I could have those there if I wanted to, or I can have them above it here. It makes no difference, but these two variables are used here, so they must be defined before there. And this function must be defined before it is called, which is that line there. So the function has to sit above this. Sorry, this function has to sit above where it's called. So what's going to happen now is we're going to take two inputs, one for a name, one for an age. Then we're going to pass them into this function. The function uses them here and here. Now, the important thing to note is the order matters. If you get the order wrong, you'll get unexpected results, and we'll have a look at that shortly. So let's put a breakpoint in and let's start running the code. Step over that first bit. Run the second one. I'm not telling you how old I am, so we'll go for 100. And then we'll step into this function, because if I step over it, it will just do all of this bit without showing what's happening. So I've stepped into the function and we can see we've assigned, oh, maybe I need to zoom out. Actually, I can just maximize it again. We can see that user age has been set to 100 and username set to Ms. Payne. And then we're just going to run this print statement which combines them all as an output. Okay, so I did say I would show you what happens if we put these the wrong way around. So age, comma, name. So remember, this code runs first, so it's still going to do this in the same order. Step into. Look what's happened now though. We have username is now 100 and user age is now Muzpain. Now all we're doing in here is printing. So this will still print, but watch the output. This is why we have to be very careful about the order of the variables. We make them relatable name-wise for the programmer, for the person reading the code, for you and I. We set the order of the variables for the computer. That's what the compiler uses. The order is absolutely imperative. Okay, what have we got? Returning values. Okay, so let's take another sample of code. Once again, we've got a few inputs. So we've got a name, age, which is being cast to an integer. That in this one is important. We did that in the previous one, but because we were only printing, it didn't really matter. In this one, we're going to be doing a calculation, therefore it does matter. And here we're going to do another input, which is again cast to an integer. Now, this calculation is imprecise. It's just an example of using a subroutine, passing in values and returning a value. So let's just move that code down actually. So what we have, we've got the subroutine, 3 inputs, then we call the subroutine here, we pass in age, we pass in year, that translates up here to user age and current year, again making them different but relatable so that we can see as a person easily what's what. We're making sure that we match the order that they're passed in. Inside the subroutine, we create a local variable. This can only be accessed inside the subroutine. And then we calculate the current year, subtract the user's age, and we call that year born, and we store that inside or assign it to the variable year born. We then return year born to the point that the subroutine was called. So the return value here gets assigned or stored in the variable DOB, date of birth. And then at the end we print. So let's put a breakpoint in, run it and see how that goes. Once again, we start by taking an input. What's your name? Pain. Step over the next one. How old are you? Did I type that wrong? Let me just run that again. Because I could have hit a miss key. If I did, it would explain the crash. Yeah, I must have done that. Okay, what year is it? 2023. Oh, I've stepped over that by mistake. So we can see that it said that based on that data, I would be born in 1923, and then it outputs the print. Let's do that again and actually step in this time. In fact, I'm going to take that off. Right, so this time we've hit this point. There's nothing assigned to DOB at the moment. And we're about to call this subroutine, and we're going to pass in age and year. We'll step into it. So we can see that current year is 2023, user age is 100, exactly like we saw previously. Step over the next one, we can see that the year born is now set to 1923, because the current year, which is 2023 minus 100 is 1923. We're going to return year born. This, when I click the next step into, will assign the value to date of birth. We've done the calculation, it's been returned, and now it will assign it. And then finally we have the print statement. Okay, so moving swiftly on. Let's have a look at nesting subroutines. Now, at the moment, this code won't actually run, but all I need to do is add in a user input and it will. We have two subroutines. The first one that actually gets called is user input, and it gives reference to the global variable list data. It takes a name, an age, a year. So this is almost exactly the same code that we used before. Again, we've got DOB, and then we're calculating the year born. So this is calling a subroutine from within a subroutine. So we're calling calculate year born from within user input. So let's have a look at that. We're going to put the breakpoint on user input so we can see it step by step. Show the console. So step into user input. We come down to the first one is asking for the name. It's exactly the same as we saw before, but this time it's happening inside this user input. So far, this is exactly the same as we got before. Now, I'm going to step into here so we can see what happens. It moves down into this subroutine. It performs the calculation. We can see the values have been passed in here and here. So year born is now set to 1923. It returns, but because it's been called from within the subroutine, it returns back to where it's been called, here. Step over it or step into again, it will assign it. And we can see that nothing has happened to list date because we haven't done anything with that. However, what I could do would just be list data dot append, and that would then assign that to the list. Okay. So, up to now, although we've seen subroutines being used, all the subroutines that we have used could have been easily done without them. Where they really come into their own is when we've got a subroutine in conjunction with a loop or other subroutines like we start to see to build up slightly bigger code. So we're going to look at creating this in code. So we're going to declare a variable. We're going to set it to true. Then we're going to run a while loop. And we're going to say, while we want more input, keep running this loop. So while we still want more input, keep running this loop. At the point we don't want more input, we stop. So we're going to start with this here. Now, you will see a couple of problems in this. We've defined it, but at the moment we haven't got the user input subroutine and we don't have the more input subroutine. So let's add those. Now, actually, I think I might want to backtrack. We can see that this now works, but I'm going to delete the contents of this for now, because this is going to take user input. For the time being, I'm just going to delete that, because we also need another function here So both of those are covered, but obviously we need more data because it doesn't do a lot now. So I'm going to put the rest of this back in and then we'll talk through what this is going to do. So this is the first one here. This is the user input. It gives global access to list data, which I haven't added. I need to add that in. And this is a good example of how we can use our IDE. It told me that that didn't exist, so I can now add it. So we have global access to list data. We've set a variable called more to true. That's a Boolean variable. It's set to true. And we're saying while more, and remember that that is the same as doing that. So while more is true, we're going to take user input and then we're going to recheck to see if we want more user input. So this first one then, because this needs creating and adding more to, we'll look at that in a minute, but we've got another user input. So we've got the three inputs, which we've seen before. We have name is input that, age and year. This time we've got a DOB and we're calculating, and we're going to use the same calculate function as before. We are going to do a concatenation, and then we're going to append the result of the concatenation to this variable data, and then we're going to append that variable data into list data, which is up in global scope here. So we've now got a subroutine, which is this one, that's calling a subroutine, which is calling two other subroutines. So we need to add these in. Now we've seen these subroutines before, so we know how these subroutines actually work. We're going to add in a calculate year born. It is just a year born minus the current year, and we return it, so that will return to there. We haven't seen the concatenate yet, but it is just joining two strings. So that takes in a username, the user age, and the year born, and it joins it all together into a single string. And then it returns it to the place it was called, which will be here. So we also need to put the more input in, because once we've done these two, this will return here, and then it calls this subroutine here. So this one is going to be our more input subroutine. And in this, we ask the user if they want to enter more data. We store that or assign that the result of that into this variable here called more, and then we return it. The only thing left to do in our little program here is to add a call to take input, which we can add at the bottom down here. Now I'm going to zoom out a bit to show this. So the code is going to start here. Let's step in. So we're going to take an input, we'll step into that, and we come up here. We've defined access to this global variable. We've set more to true, and we've said while more is true, we're going to do this. So we'll step in again, go into our while loop, then we're going to step into user input. So name, it's console access. This is exactly the same piece of code that we've seen before. We're just building it into part of a bigger program at this point. Okay, so we've done that one. We've now got this. I stepped over that by mistake, but we've seen that code before. In fact, let me do that again, because I should have stepped into rather than stepping over. My apologies. There. So we're back at the same point. We've just taken the three inputs. We're about to call this subroutine here, so I'll step into that. We've got the two user variables here. We've done the calculation. Going to return that value, so it comes back up here because it returns to where it was called. That is then assigned to DOB, so DOB is now 1923 or 1923. Now this next one, again, we're calling a subroutine and we're passing in data. We've got name, age and date of birth, which we can see name, age, And we also have a DOB now. Step into that. You can see those 3 values assigned here. We've now got the data after it's made this string that's concatenated everything. Is this string here. Just note that I have cast to string here and here. And then we're going to return this data value. So we've done the subroutine. The next click I do assigns it. So that's data. And now we're going to append this value in data to the list data. So at this point, we've completed the subroutine user data. Step into again, and then we're going to call the subroutine more input. Step in. We take an input. First of all, we're going to ask a question. Would you like to enter another name? Yes or no? Let's put yes first time. This then performs a Boolean calculation. We set yes, no to lower. So if you typed in a uppercase Y, it converts it to lowercase y before we see if it is equal to lowercase y. That just allows for people making typing mistakes, not reading carefully, etc. So what this is saying is if the input is equal to lowercase y, this will be true. So if I step into again, we can see that more is now set to true. We return more. When I click again, it's going to assign the result from more input into that more there. More is still true because we've just assigned it here. So while more is true, we do a user input again. So that could be 20 this time, and let's say it's the same year. Right, so we're going to step over these this time because we've already seen this bit running through once. It's just going through exactly the same process. So we're back to the same point. We've finished user input. We're going to come down to more input. We're going to take the user input again. Now this time I'm going to put N for no, although I could type any character. Any character other than Y will result in this being no. So we can see this time it's false, so we're going to be returning false. So when I assign the return value of here to more in the next click, more is now false. Because this more is now false, it will drop out of the subroutine. It returns back to where it was originally called, and then the program finishes. Okay, that's the full version, and it's just a demonstration of the power of using subroutines, because this could be used multiple times, this is used multiple times, and in each case it's using these functions, and they're all broken down so that this is quite easily readable, and we just follow it through. Each of these in their own loops, working together as a cohesive unit. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Sarah Payne, and this is the first of my Python at intermediate level tutorials, and we've been covering